Hello, my loves, and welcome back to either Strange Playgrounds or Our Lives in Horror, depending on which channel you're listening to this on. Recently, I've been delving through the various recesses and hidden quarters of my little place, my maisonette, because it's been renovated. So what I've had to do is get all the stuff that's just been, like, shoved into wall spaces and whatnot into the odd little cupboards that line this place and get them packed away. But in the process of doing that, I've rediscovered loads of old material, loads of old bits and pieces, books and video games and old video game consoles and whatnot that had just been put away, you know, because I either don't have the means of using them anymore or they were just shoved away there for expediency's sake, to be perfectly honest. I found my old copy of Clive Barker's Undying for the PC. Bloody hell, that takes me back. Playing that on my original PC way back when. Back when PC gaming was really coming into its own. I found my original copy of Final Fantasy VII from when I was 14. And that's, wow, that's a bit of a doozy. That's a little bit of a flashback, I can tell you, alongside the less popular Final Fantasy VIII, which I never really liked very much for lots and lots of reasons. I never really got... For me, it wasn't anything to do with the mechanics, it was the story. I never really got on with the story in 8. I mean, the characters I found very annoying for the most part. I found them very, unlike, say, Final Fantasy VII, where each of the characters had their own backstory and it was made explicit in their own sort of bespoke quest, and that's how you got to know them, that's how you got to associate and engage with them. Final Fantasy VIII doesn't really have that. There's something frictionless about the characters, and even when you do get to know them, they're annoying. You know, people like the main character Squall. I never liked. I hated Squall. It's that notion of being like the mopiness of him. That, you know, from the get-go, Squall Leonhart is this incredibly handsome, athletic, capable hyper assassin in this privileged, hyper technical school for hyper assassins. He has not much to complain about, and yet he is this mopey kind of diffident, inarticulate character who is really difficult to get on with. I really didn't like him. In comparison to, say, Cloud. Now, Cloud's really interesting because there is a tendency for people to, as a result of the extended media, as opposed to his appearance in the original game and indeed the remake, to condemn him. Oh, he's this mopey kind of emo character. Well, no, actually, no. If you play the original game, he's not that. At the beginning, he's very much not that. He's this cocky, brash, slightly happy-go-lucky guy. And of course, if you know the game's mythology, you know exactly why that is and why that's so interesting. It's not until later on, when he has his existential crises, he becomes much more reserved and introspective, and it makes sense. He has earned that status, right? I mean, those of you who don't know, there's a point, I'm not going to spoil too much, but there's a point in the game, the original game anyway, where Cloud has this incredible existential crisis of identity, where he basically learns that he is not who he thinks he is. He's not even what he thinks he is. There's a lot of stuff bound up in Cloud that's really, really fascinating. And so he earns the status, you know? The transition makes sense, and his status at the end of the game makes sense, whereas Squall, not so much. Squall is irritating almost from the get-go. And I could never get a bead on it. I could never get a bead on the characters or the world or the mythology. There's good stuff in it, don't get me wrong. I don't want to sort of condemn it wholesale. There's some really interesting stuff in Final Fantasy VIII. Like the way you can break the game. I mean, my God, that game basically begs to be broken. You can make your characters so incredibly powerful, almost from the first instance, if you know what you're doing, if you know how that junction system works. You could do some amazing things. You can make your characters, just by playing about with the junctioning system, you can absolutely make your characters into monsters. But I just could not get a bead on it. I could not engage with the world in the same way that I did in Final Fantasy VII. And really, that's been pretty much the case for most of the Final Fantasy games since, apart from the remake. 9 I liked very, very much. That was a very interesting piece of work. And going back as well and playing the ones that were never released in the UK, like Final Fantasy VI, which was Final Fantasy III in the West, I do believe. That's wonderful. That's a stunning game. Again, because it has these very well written, very well defined characters who each have their arc within the game, within the overall structure. Even the villain, like in 7, Sephiroth has an incredible story. The same is true of Kefka. Kefka's a slightly different style of villain. He's more like the Joker. He's this completely broken, almost pure psychopath. And that makes him interesting too. Because, of course, in Final Fantasy VI, you get that really shocking moment where he wins. He just wins. He becomes God. He effectively becomes God, the God of this world, and he destroys it. There's a turning point in Final Fantasy VI where the world changes dramatically, and it's where Kefka effectively becomes God and unmakes reality and patches it back together according to his own whims. And that's a really frightening thing, right? Reality as the portrait of the whims of a psychopath. That's what Final Fantasy VI gives you. And the final fight with Kefka, if you haven't seen it, is amazing. It's absolutely beautiful, as it is with Sephiroth in Final Fantasy VII. In 8, the villains are really ill-defined. They're really ill-defined. Initially, you get Edea, who has some depth to her, but she's not really the villain. She's possessed by the real villain, who's this sorceress from the future called Ultimecia, and you get nothing of her. You really know nothing about her until you face her. You don't even know she exists until like right at the end. So she's kind of just like, oh, I'm a villain. I'm just evil. I'm the super evil from the end of the world. And that's it. That's really it. She's visually interesting. She's aesthetically interesting. The things she turns into at the end are really cool. But it just doesn't do it for me. I often find that these RPGs, certainly the JRPGs, they live or die by their villains. If the villain's good, then usually you'll get a decent story out of it. But that's really not the case in 8 for me. I know a lot of people love it, and I'm not coming down on them at all. If it engages you, it engages you, and that's it. But it really didn't for me. It really didn't. I mean, I remember being massively disappointed by it, actually, because after the incredible success of 7 and the way, I mean, I kid you not, that came to me at a time in my formative years when media like that changed the topography of my imagination. It was happening all the time at that point, discovering Clive Barker a few years earlier, discovering all these new writers and artists and comic books and whatnot. It was changing the nature of my imagination. And Final Fantasy VII did that, and in that regard, it's kind of a sacred artifact. And this was probably unfair. This was an unfair expectation. I kind of expected 8 to do the same, and it just didn't. In fact, I never completed it as a kid. I put it down. I got frustrated with it. I got to Adele, the big sorceress monster, and I got irritated with it, and I put it down, and that was it. I didn't care enough. That was the problem. I didn't care enough. Whereas for Final Fantasy VII, I did everything. Like, I played the game multiple times over. I did all the chocobo racing. I got the Knights of the Round. I did all of the chocobo breeding stuff. I killed all the weapons, got all of their stuff, all of the ultimate materia, all of that gubbins. Did all of that, worked all the characters up to their ultimate states, got all their ultimate weapons and limit breaks. Because I was 14, I didn't have anything better to do at that point. You can't judge him. You can't judge me for that. At the age of 14, I really didn't have anything better to do with my life, quite frankly. I was writing at that point, but it wasn't serious. I didn't really seriously sit down and start writing until a year later, until I was 15. Then I really started. And Final Fantasy VII probably had a lot to do with that. It probably had a great deal to do with that, to be perfectly honest, because I was so moved by it. I was so engaged and inspired by the story and the way the villain was written, and all the villains, actually. I like all the villains in Final Fantasy VII, even the really simplistic ones like Rufus and Heidegger. What they lack in character, they they have a sort of metaphorical representation that really, really works for the game, you know? And I really liked that. Hojo's a great villain. Really love Hojo. And it makes me very excited, actually, for what they're going to do with the next installment of the remake. It's obviously going to be a current gen, or even maybe next gen piece of work. But what will that be? What shape will it take? Because, of course, we've done the Midgar stuff now, which was just the first... It wasn't even the first disc of the original game, Midgar. It was a very small part of the original game. It was just like the first little section. And then there's this really amazing reveal moment when you get outside the walls and the world map opens up and you realise it's just one city. And this world is huge! I remember that experience so powerfully, getting out of Midgar for the first time, because that's a real climax at the end of Midgar, you know. That first chapter is amazing. When the game opens up, when you realise what the stakes are, when Sephiroth establishes himself as the real villain, when you discover Jenova for the first time, and you leave Midgar behind, and you go into the wider world, and that map... Honestly, it was a moment. I think a lot of gamers had that, actually. And that's what did it. That's what Final Fantasy VII did. It's these moments that really... It expanded our contexts and our assumptions of what the medium could do. We just didn't realise that it was this thing, that it could do this, that it was beyond our preconceptions, especially us in the UK, because RPGs like JRPGs, they did exist, but they were rare. They were rare. We had... very, very few released here. We had The Secret of Evermore, which was my first, and I bloody loved that on the Super Nintendo. You had The Illusion of Gaia, I think was released here. Terranigma was released here, I believe, and that was beautiful. I think that may have been the last RPG on the SNES, you know. I don't know whether it was Terranigma, Super Mario RPG, or Chrono Trigger. Chrono Trigger and... Super Mario RPG were not released here. Despite being advertised in magazines, they were not released here, which was really sad, right? Because those two are amazing. Chrono Trigger, I played that much later on. I played that when I got my first PC, when we got the internet at home, and I got an emulator, because that's what people did back then, right? That was the culture. That's when I played Chrono Trigger for the first time, when it was really anachronistic, really. I mean, we were well into the PlayStation era at that point, and moving into the ascendancy of the PC, so it was really moving far, far away from the days of the Super Nintendo. But Chrono Trigger is so good. The game itself is so good. The story is so good that it doesn't matter. It is still one of the best RPGs you will find, and certainly on the Super Nintendo, it's beautiful. It's absolutely stunning. If I can Let's Play that, I'll do that. I will do Chrono Trigger. If I can find a way of recording it off my laptop or whatever, I'll do it, because Chrono Trigger is the tits. It is absolutely fantastic. Is Chrono Trigger. I couldn't believe the stuff they did with that game. I couldn't believe it was on the Super Nintendo. It's so huge, it's so expansive, it's got 13 different endings. You can play it through again after you've completed it. It's massive enough as it is, but you can play it again after you've completed it and get different endings depending on what you do. It's amazing. It's an amazing piece of work. But yeah, Final Fantasy VII really did explode my preconceptions of what was possible in storytelling in video games, and that happened a lot during that era. You had things like, a little later on, things like System Shock 2, which was another thing I found knocking about. My original boxed copy, when PC games used to come in cardboard boxes, ladies and gentlemen, with artwork on the front, I found my original copy of... System Shock 2, which if you've been watching my Dead Space Let's Play, you'll know I reference that quite a lot, because it is a formative game. It's a formative game not only just for those very few people who played it. It was only on the PC, which was a very niche format at the time. That was its only release, and it was sort of swept under the rug a little bit, System Shock 2. In the shadow of things like Half-Life and Deus Ex, it got swept under the rug, and that is a real shame, because although I loved both Half-Life and Deus Ex, they are amazing, significant games. System Shock 2 is my favourite of all of them. System Shock 2 is an elevation in video game horror. It it basically was the beginning of the end for survival horror. Survival horror had been the mainstay of horror storytelling in video games, and almost like the default format for the longest time since Resident Evil and Silent Hill came about on the PlayStation. That it was the default form of horror. That's what people assumed horror was in video games because it was so pervasive, that format, you know. System Shock 2 comes along and it just destroys all of that. It's an entirely different style of game with an entirely different style of storytelling, much darker, much nastier. A science fiction body horror game with psychological elements. It is absolutely beautiful. I don't recall, up until very recently, with the renaissance in indie horror games that's been happening of late, I don't recall being so acutely afraid and tense and filled with sincere dread playing a video game as System Shock 2. There's something very distinct about the way it tells its story, the way it's all in universe, it's all within the world, everything feels sincere and legitimately part of the world that you are in. This sort of science fiction horror setting, which is this vast spaceship, this like city-sized spaceship called the Von Braun. And the Von Braun is sort of like humanity's greatest endeavor. It is the most expensive. It's to chart new frontiers. It's the first ship of its kind that can go into outer space, that can travel faster than light. That can bend, like the Event Horizon, that can bend space around it using its very peculiar drive and like alter reality around itself. It is the greatest endeavor that has ever been commissioned by humanity. And of course it all goes wrong. Obviously it all goes wrong. You actually wake up on the Von Braun and you don't know who you are. You have no memory of who you are. You have no memory of how you got there, and everything's going to shit. Everything is collapsing around you. One of the first things you have to do is escape a portion of the ship that is collapsing and depressurizing around you, guided by this voice in your head, which is actually a voice coming through like these cybernetic implants that have been involuntarily implanted into you. So there's another mystery. Why has that happened to you? Why has that been done to you? And that's what you have to do. Find out what has happened to this damn ship. What has gone wrong? Why the crew members are wandering around in absolute disarray with like their clothes hanging off in tatters with blood all over them and these hideous tumors and contusions all over them and these like parasitic worms erupting out of their chests and attaching to their skulls. Why are they murmuring to themselves in the shadows and then launching themselves at you whenever they see you? It's really scary. It's a really brilliant piece of work. That game, again, like Final Fantasy, like Resident Evil, like Silent Hill, changed my preconceptions of what the form was capable of and of what horror is capable of. That was one of those games that demonstrated to me that for the purity of experience, if what you're going for is the purity of emotion, of the arousal of dread and tension and horror and shock, video games are almost unsurpassed. They're almost unsurpassed because of the level of immersion. You are so engaged in the story and in the setting and in the characters that the horror is much more acute than if you are more passively watching a film, for example. That's not to belittle or denigrate horror cinema or TV in comparison. They're different forms. They do different things, right? But when you're talking about the purity of the experience, of the emotion, I think video games are really unsurpassed in that regard. It's very difficult and probably a mistake to even try to emulate what video games do in another format. It just doesn't really work. It can. I've seen short stories that do it to a certain degree, that try to emulate like video game formats or Skype chats or like WhatsApp discussions, and that can work. That can be really creepy. But by and large, the horror of video game stories is peculiar to video games. They often even use the nature of the format. The really clever ones use the nature of the format to evoke horror. I mean, even Resident Evil, the original Resident Evil, does that. It uses those fixed camera angles, right, and those blind corners to evoke suspicion, paranoia, tension, and dread. That can only work in video games. It can only work when you are in control of the character, right? Because you can't stop the character. If you've got a locked off screen or camera in a film, you can't stop the characters going down that corridor. You can't control their reactions to it. You have a degree of responsibility over the story that you don't have in a film or a book. They're much more passive mediums in that regard. So yeah, that was one of the games that showed me what was possible. And it's still one of the scariest games ever. It's absolutely brilliant. The atmosphere of System Shock 2. There's been talks of a remake of the original System Shock, which I never played, sadly, for a long time. That is still in development, apparently. I cannot wait to see that. It's got a lot to live up to. If they're going to try and evoke the same degree of horror, the same acuity and intensity of horror that's in System Shock 2, they've got their work cut out for them. They really do, because expectations are going to be bloody high. I can tell you my expectations are off the charts. They really, really are. I cannot even tell you. Now, after rambling for like 20 minutes about what I found in my bloody cupboards, what I wanted to talk to you about was what I've got in my hands right now, which is I found these really old trade paperbacks of the Hellraiser comics from Marvel in the 1980s. With the success of Hellraiser and Hellraiser 2, the mythos of Hellraiser expanded into other mediums. So there was this enormous project by Marvel where they published a long line of Hellraiser comics that lasted for at least a few years, these publications. And these trade paperbacks compile the best of them. There are 3 all in all. And I've got to say, I mean, I remember buying these when I was at university and just being enthralled by them. The project itself is absolutely beautiful. What makes them work is the fact that this is it's not like, say, a superhero line of comics where there is a certain coherent, arguably coherent storyline and sub-mythology and whatnot. What these represent are largely self-contained stories. There are 1 or 2 that are like in 2 parts or in 3 parts, but by and large they are little self-contained stories that are designed to demonstrate how various the interpretations of the Hellraiser mythology can be, and how various the ways that the stories can be depicted are. Because each story has a different artist, each one has a different writer. Clive Barker is one of them. There's some actually really notable writers in these stories, and these are some of their very earliest publications. So one of the bigger ones, is by the Wachowski sisters, who would later go on to fame in cinema, obviously with the likes of The Matrix. Amazing stuff, right? This must have been one of their earliest pieces of work, and it's very, very, very good indeed. Clive Barker has a 2-parter in here, which is a really fascinating one. It's called The Harrowing, and what The Harrowing sets up is that Barker clearly would have liked to have expanded the Hellraiser mythology at this time, because it's not just about Hellraiser, it's not just about Leviathan and the Cenobites and the Labyrinth. There's actually a sister goddess in here called Mortimame, who is Leviathan's sister. She's another goddess who has her own aspects and qualities, and her own followers, who she calls the Harrowers, who are counterposed to Leviathan's hell. And that's really fascinating, right? It looks like what Barker would have liked to have done is set up like a wider mythology and dynamic of conflicting divinities around the Hellraiser mythology. And that would have been, I mean, if that would have gone on, that would have been absolutely fascinating, right? There's a story in the first collection that I particularly love. It's by Neil Gaiman, and it's called Wordsworth. It's very short, very experimental. The artist is Dave McKean, of course, who has a particular connection to Neil Gaiman. And for me, for my particular interests in Hellraiser, for my preconceptions of what the mythology is, this is the one, this is the story. Dave McKean's artwork in this is so experimental, as it often is. It's very like the artwork in Arkham Asylum. You know, the Batman's comic, which, by the way, if you haven't read that, go and read it. It's amazing. It's very akin to that. Everything is slightly surreal, dreamlike, nightmare-like, very, very distorted. And that element it escalates as the story goes on. A lot of the story is symbolic and metaphorical, and the little bits of prose that you get in it, you could cut them out, put them together, and publish them as a sort of prose poetry story, and it would work. It would really work. What I love about the story more than anything is that, unlike many of them, many of the stories are obsessed with sort of like the obscenity and the repulsiveness and the horror of the Hellraiser mythology. And yeah, that's interesting. But what gets me about Wordsworth is it goes deeper. It explores why people would want to explore Leviathan's labyrinth. What is attractive about the mythology and the ideologies of the Cenobites, how someone could fall into becoming a Cenobite, in fact. That's what this explores, and it's really wonderful. It also establishes that the boxes are not the only ways in. The boxes are just one sort of metaphorical representation of obsession, and that's the key for Leviathan. Obsession is the key. The boxes are just one. The lead character of this story, the eponymous Wordsworth, he's this dry, dusty Victorian librarian who is obsessed with words. He's obsessed with words, and that's largely it. He has this very... He promotes himself as being this very buttoned down, very mousy, quiet man who has... You know, to look at him, you'd think that he has no depths and no contradictions in his soul at all. But he's given this word puzzle whilst on a train, and this word puzzle is really strange and mysterious. It's shaped, rather than like a crossword, it's shaped like a spiral, like a descending spiral, like a Gaia. And as he's solving the puzzle, he realizes that the words are experiences. They are things from his own life, from his own past, things that he's done that he's ashamed of, and they are things that the puzzle leads him to do and to engage with, which become more and more and more extreme, to the point where by the end he is this pierced, scarred, tattooed, lacerated, suppurating thing that's experienced everything the world has to offer before the final clue, which is the doorway. And of course he writes hell, and then the puzzle opens and the Cenobites come, and he is transformed, he is reconfigured, he is undone and patched back together as basically... He is the tome keeper, the storyteller of hell. The words, the stories endlessly tattoo themselves on his reconfiguring flesh, and he tells the stories of hell, and he is exultant in it. He's one of those people, a bit like Dr. Channard in Hellraiser 2, who exults in that condition. That's what I like about this story. It demonstrates how you could want this, how there's a certain purity in Leviathan's embrace that is desirable. You become an abstraction of yourself. You become something more. So as Pinhead says in the original Hellraiser, demons to some, angels to others, right? And Wordsworth is definitely an angel, a Cenobitic angel, one of Leviathan's angels, and therefore a twisted and dark one, but an angel nonetheless. And that's what I love. For me, that ambiguity, that element of the horrific or the status of being a monster or a creature, something liminal, why it's desirable, why there is something worth celebrating in that monstrosity. That's what the Hellraiser mythology really does for me. And too often that's just ignored. That ambiguity is just completely ignored. It goes for the extreme, like visuals, the gore, the pain, blah 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 blah, which there's worth in. Don't get me wrong, I can really go for that. I can really go for that shit. I really can. But this kind of story, this just gets it insofar as I'm concerned. It gets what Hellraiser is about at its base, and why its appeal has endured to this day, even amongst people who don't necessarily understand why it's so different from other mythologies of the era, its contemporaries, why its appeal is so disturbing and so ambiguous, and why it excites emotions that are a little bit more complex than those that you would get from, say, A Nightmare on Elm Street or Halloween or whatever. This one just gets it. I love that story. And don't get me wrong, I mean, if you do seek these things out, be warned. like content warnings all the way down for everything. These stories explore the real depths of humanity. I mean, there's even one called The Girl in the Peephole, written by Del Stone Jr., and that goes to places. That's a very unpleasant piece of work. It really, really is a nasty piece of work, that one. In fact, they all are. They're all pretty grim, but they're all fascinating. They all have their own bespoke takes on what the mythology means. You know, they all have their own peculiar politics and metaphysics, and they interpret Leviathan and the boxes and the Cenobites themselves in different, subtly different ways. And I love that. I absolutely love that. It's like getting a really good short story collection cohered around a common theme, where you've got an anthology rather, where you've got different writers giving their takes on the subject, exploring the subject according to their own experiences and contexts and preconceptions. That, to me, is the shit. I love that to bits. And these are really good. I've got to say, I love these trade paperbacks. I really, really do. There are more recent Hellraiser comics, but they're different from these. They're different. They are not sort of self-contained stories. They are ongoing stories for the most part, and they're fine. They're absolutely fine. They do some interesting things, but I'm not as keen on them. They're a bit more coherent. They're a bit more Marvel-like, you know, even though they're not published by Marvel. They're a bit more coherent. They've got a more common style about them. And that's fine, you know, that's what they're attempting to do. But give me this any day. Give me the anthology any day. I love this stuff. I really do. And I mean, I imagine these are expensive now, especially the big ones, the second and third one, which are huge. I imagine these are expensive now because they're quite rare. But if you do get the chance, seek them out. They are really, really good. I massively enjoy these. Visually alone, the variety of different art styles, you know, the variety of different types of story and aesthetic. It's just fascinating. It's fascinating stuff. Wonderful little projects. Wonderful projects. I'd love to do something similar with Aberrice, to be honest. You know, my mythology from Born in Blood. I would love to do something similar with that, see how different people interpret that particular mythology. Wow, I would love to do that. Maybe a project for later on, who knows. Until next time, my loves, bye-bye!